Hello again, everybody, and welcome back. I hope you guys had another good week. So your second major assignment, or the first half of your second major assignment, was due this week. So we're working on designing your own building, and this is actually the culmination of our perspective unit in this class. After we finish this assignment, we're moving on to anatomy for the rest of the semester. So we get to change things up a little bit here, which is great. And so this is really, everything you guys have learned about perspective you are putting together in this assignment here. And so the first half was all about designing your building, getting it set up, and then next week you're doing your thumbnails and your perspective drawings, which is basically, the finished piece of your building that you're showing off. So you had several parts that you had to hand in this week. You had to hand in your references, which is worth 10 points. You had to do silhouettes of your building, which is just black, fully black silhouettes of that building, worth 10 points. You had to do these concept orthographic drawings. So it's kind of like a merging of concept drawings with, in that orthographic view where you're just thinking of the front of the building. For extra credit, you could have done the orthographic drawings of the front, top, and side views of your building, which a couple of you guys did, which is great. It's worth another 10 points. And then the isometric drawing was the final thing you had to hand in this week, and that's worth 10 points as well. And of course, the Photoshop file. So, you guys, honestly, you did a great job this week. I am concerned about the number of you who handed in homework. We're missing a few here, but those of you who did really did a great job. So I'm super happy. I think this should be a relatively short critique here. This is just to make sure you guys are on track before you go into your finished, thumbnails and perspective drawing. I want to make sure everything is nailed and figured out, and that I want to try to catch any, mistakes before you move on any farther. But I think most of you are in a great spot. There's a couple of you, a few little things here you struggled with, but otherwise, I think everything looks nice. So let us get into this here. Some of you may have noticed on the assignment sheet, I had a few inconsistencies about the saving of the JPEGs for like the orthographic and the isometric. So if that was confusing at all, I had made a mistake. I hadn't fixed what was at the end to match the beginning. Anyway, if I was lenient on it, whatever you guys handed in. As long as you handed in your orthographic and your isometric drawings, whether or not they were on the same page or separate pages, I didn't, deduct any points for that. As long as you did it, I counted it. So sorry if there was any confusion on that. But otherwise, I think that's all I wanted to talk about before I get into this. Okay, so let's do this here. This shouldn't take too long. Let's see, we're going to start... Let's start from the middle and work our way up. So we've got Christopher, nothing from you. Matab, so you had emailed me about, your design here that you're working on. I think a mosque is a great idea. I think it's really interesting, unique. It allows you to explore, designs that are different than what we see every day here, in this country. So I think it's really fun. I'm glad you did it. I love your mosque design here, so I'd say go ahead with it. There are a couple challenging things, like you had mentioned the domes you had trouble with, which I'll get to in a minute, but otherwise I think this is a really interesting and unusual building to work on. So your references, I think all looked good. I'm not going to dive into that. Silhouettes, some of your silhouettes here, they feel a little repetitive. You were kind of keeping to, granted, I don't know mosque design. I've not really looked into them myself, so I don't know how much variation there is in the design of them, but a lot of yours kind of have that like big central dome here. I think you actually did a good job of varying them, but there is a little bit of redundancy in some of these. Like some of these are pretty similar. You did more than the minimum 10 here, so I'm not deducting any points for it, but I just want you to know, you do want to get some variety, but I do like that you actually did push it on a couple of these here where, you're kind of like probably breaking the rules and like, well, let's try a totally different design. And that's what I like to see. And so especially like to see your last few designs that you're really like, okay, like feel like I've done everything that's been done before. What can I do that's ridiculous? So I like where you're kind of going here. But otherwise, silhouettes are good. But I think it came with the same, I think the problem here that I was seeing about, there is some redundancy that's happening. I think your orthographics did end up pretty similar. You definitely have significant changes in like your style of the windows here on all of them, even like the outer shape. I like how you played around with the shape on it here. But if you like squint at these, all three of these are very similar. They got the big towers on the outside, the big one in the middle. They all kind of look like that. Once again, I don't know, how much variety there is in mosque design. Can't say myself, but that's my little concern here. But otherwise, I think these designs are all really nice. So then moving ahead here, I'm going to open up this. So you did do the extra credit. You did do the isometric or the orthographic views here. There are a couple things. You just want to make sure you stay consistent with your views here. So for here, from this view, you had, about this much room between the front and the back. But then when we get here, you have this much room, between the front of the grid and the front of your building, here and here. But then here, the front of the grid and front of your building is much bigger. And essentially you just moved it back. It looks like you moved the whole thing to the back of it, so it lined up to the back. But really, you want it to stay consistent with all your grids, because if you imagine this as that three-dimensional grid, it should all match up. So either this one, you just cut this and paste this and move it forward, or move this one back. So that's the only thing. Just making sure it's consistent. This here, I do wish you had the grid on still, but luckily I can tell, everything's lining up, everything's parallel, so that's all great. It looks consistent with your design here. The only thing you're missing is your domes. Now, the domes are definitely going to be a challenge, but really, if you think about it, they're kind of like modified cylinders, right? So if I was to do this here, I would do an ellipse for the bottom, and then I would find what's like the widest point here. Technically, this is just a series of ellipses that are stacked on top of each other, right? Of different sizes. So that's why I want you to go into this thinking of it, and you don't have to draw every single ellipse to get this right. What I'm going to tell you to do is to draw a couple ellipses and then fill in the gaps. So we're going to draw a bottom ellipse. I would say find the widest point, draw an ellipse there, and then you could probably just do maybe an ellipse here, and then you just draw a point, and it's just essentially connecting the dots. So you do that ellipse, you do the ellipse that would be above it, that'd be slightly bigger for that widest point, and this is probably too high, but then you'd figure out maybe another ellipse here, and then figure out like where the tippity top is, and then you just connect the dots. So that's how I would build these. It definitely is more work. Obviously, anytime you're dealing with ellipses, anything cylindrical is always going to be, that another little challenge that you're going to have to deal with. But after that, everything else in your building is really just straight up and down, or vertical or horizontal. So that's probably the most challenging thing. It just takes time, to draw each of the ellipses and figure out each ellipses so they're correct. But that's how I would do this. And yeah, that's it. And then you'd be good. These actually, you did a good job of faking these here. I think these look believable enough, especially for the isometric. I do want things to be, on point for the isometric, but if they're a little bit, off, I'm a little forgiving on it. So that's what you would do for them. And that would just take, the time of figuring out the ellipses. But otherwise, in isometric, that's easy enough because all ellipses essentially look the same. So you can make that one ellipse and then copy and paste it and, make it bigger or smaller to fit in, in where they line up, because there are different sized ellipses. So that's it. That's all it would take. Other than that, I think this all looks good. I believe I said I wish you had left the grid on just so I could see, but otherwise I think this all looks great. Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything else. No, I think that's really it. I'd say you're in a great spot here. I love your like window designs that are going on here. Make sure these stay, whatever this design is, which I'm assuming is the windows, make sure when you get to the perspective that you stay consistent with it. Really, you're going to be, these are like billboards, essentially, when you go to do them in perspective. So if you think about these windows, when you get to your perspective view, if they're all lined up like this, I'm picturing like these three here. Remember to use subdivision to help things get laid out. You probably don't need to do the measuring point or anything, but if you do subdivision, you know, find where the center is, and that'll tell you like where the peak of this is here, and you know, find some way to make this pattern easy for you that you can replicate it in perspective. Maybe just find a way to divide up the space that makes it easier for you. So that's the only thing I really see you having some challenge with going ahead here, is whatever this design is, especially when you get wrapping around cylinder here. Do remember too that these are all ellipses that you are going to have to deal with. So that means every single one of these ellipses you're going to have to figure out too when you get to your finished one. It depends on what viewpoint you choose for your final drawing. You're not going to see the entire thing, but I just want to remind you that you are going to have to figure them out in the perspective. Otherwise, it won't look right. But otherwise, you're in a great spot here. I think everything else looks good. So yeah, you're in a good spot. That's just where you could finish up your isometric drawing, get those domes in, and you're good to go. Okay, great. Moving on. Nicholas, Nathan, Sydney. Okay, Sydney, you are in an excellent spot here. Your references looked good. Your silhouettes are great. I think you have really great variety in here between, you know, all of these. There's like some that are short and stout, some that are really long and tall. I think you did a great job of pushing this, so that looks excellent. Your orthographics are really nice. All very different, all very unique versions of this building, so I think that looks great. When we get to this here, so you went with this building, which I think is good. Some things I want you to think about. I do like your sketch here. I think your isometric sketch looks good. I think you have a little bit of leeway when you go ahead in this, because I feel like this is the type of building that could be falling apart a little bit. So if things are a little bit off, you know, if your perspective's a little bit off, I feel like you got that leeway. You know, if buildings falling apart, things aren't totally straight, I think that will work for this. So something to keep in mind. But things that you will need to figure out are your ellipses. So you got to remember when you move forward here that this tower is a cylinder. It's really all it is. It's just a cylinder. So you got an ellipse here. You got an ellipse here. Even the window, remember this is following an ellipse that's going around the building. So these are all ellipses that you are going to need to figure out. Also, your wheel here for the, I don't even know I can't even think of what it's called. It's not a windmill. That's all I can think of right now. Whatever the wheel here is, this is also a ellipse or a cylinder. It's a cylinder on its side. So really for your isometric, this is definitely off for the cylinder. Remember, you should have figured out what that cylinder looks like, or that ellipse looks like for this to fit on. Remember, in the isometric view, this ellipse and this ellipse look exactly the same, and this ellipse look exactly the same. So in isometric, that's super easy. It's when you get to the perspective that you're gonna have to remember that each of these ellipses are going to look different, and you have to figure them out. There's no other way around it. So I'm warning you now, when you get to your final, that you're going to need to figure out ellipses. Remember to do the whole thing where draw the square first that this, you know, cylinder fits in. And actually you could have it go to maybe like here, Like if you're to draw your rectangle box, have it go to like the bottom of that. Yeah. And then you're essentially just going to put a little hat on top of this here. And this ellipse will be wider than, you know, your bottom ellipse here because of how, you know, you have it designed. So make sure, actually, this ellipse is wider than this one. So you probably will make a second box that fits on top of this. That's for, you know, the ellipse that's on top. So remember, think of it's like a little hat that's on top of it. So those are the things I want you to think about. This ellipse too, remember these are just ellipses that are turned on their side. So it'd be the same thing. You would draw the box, and this would be a much like narrower box, but you would draw the box that this would fit in. I'm like trying to throw this on here. Remember, everything goes back to those rectangular boxes, and then you'd figure out the ellipse on the top and the ellipse on the bottom. So things you're gonna have to do as you're going forward. And depends what viewpoint you do, but I don't think there's a viewpoint where, you know, you're going to be avoiding this, because this is part of your, you know, it's part of your building. And we may not see all of it depending what viewpoint it is, especially if it's a horizontal drawing. I doubt we'll see the top and bottom. So that's okay if we don't see it all. But remember, you need to figure that out. Same thing with the window. Remember, this window, it wraps around the body of that building. So this is the ellipse, and that's why I drew this one here, because you're going to have to figure out the ellipse of the entire building to figure out the angle that this one goes at. Other things just to think about for this type of building, it looks like it's made of stone. If you were going to do like lines of stone that were around this, like if it was like bricks, you know, that were stacked on top of each other, if you were to do that, that's not what I see here, but just want you to know, then you would have to figure out literally every single ellipse that's on here, because in perspective, you know, each one of those ellipses will look different. But your design, you know, you cut it kind of simple here, where we're just going to see like a couple bricks on here, which I'm totally fine with. Just make sure those bricks look like, you know, they are wrapping around that ellipse. So remember what I talked about way back in the beginning, where when you have your horizon line, ellipses that are closer to the horizon will be narrower, and as we get farther away, you know, that thickness of them gets thicker and thicker. So you can get a little bit of leeway with your bricks here, or, you know, if you just do like a couple floating bricks, just make sure you're keeping perspective in mind so they look like they're wrapping around the building still. So that's really it. I don't have any real, you know, changes for anything you did this week. Mostly just advice for you going forward. So you're in a great spot. Just keep all that in mind, and I think this should come out great. Okay, excellent. Moving on. Cam, okay, so I did not get a reference folder from you. Make sure you hand that in, because that's worth 10 points. But otherwise, your silhouettes are pretty good here. I think you did a good job of pushing them. I think, you know, you got some really unique ones here, lots of variety, so that's great. Your orthographics are excellent. Like, I can definitely tell you spent time on this. You really thought about, you know, how it fits in the grid. You filled up the grids, which is great. And you didn't slack off on details. You really spent your time. So love these. I think these are great. And then your orthographic looks excellent. Everything lines up perfectly. I love the design of this. I think it's really unique. I think it's interesting, and I think it's well built. You know, this looks totally believable as a building that already exists. And it fits perfectly in your orthographic grid, or your isometric grid. So excellent job. I have no comments on that. Just make sure you hand in your reference folder. Okay, moving on. Adam, your references looked great. Let's see, we got your silhouettes all look really good. I think you got some variety in here. Orthographics look nice. Once again, nice variety. I love the attention to detail on all of these. You definitely went with the one I wouldn't have expected, you know, from a viewpoint here, like these stand out a little bit more. But you went for one that's a little bit more scenic. That's not just a building, but you thought about the ground around it, which I think is really great. It doesn't, you know, stand up on its own as like an orthographic when you see it here, but I think it looks really great when you see the isometric version. And you really thought about like this bridge that's on here that I think looks really nice. And you thought about like the entrance to this. And so when you get to your perspective drawing, remember you have a lot of options here because you've thought about the environment that's here. And I do want environment as part of your drawing. So you could have a camera, a guy that's standing right here looking at your building. And so, you're just seeing the building here. Or you could put him on the bridge, and then looking this way. So you see maybe a little bit of the bridge. Or you could put him even like over here. So it's like looking this way. So maybe you see some of the bridge over here and some of the building. Find the views that work best. I would play around. Remember, I do want the building to be a part of this. Like I wouldn't say to do like a drawing that's all the way back here, and then you're seeing all of this and then the building's like very tiny in the background. I do want the building to kind of be a feature. So try to find an angle that includes, both. I mean, granted, you could not include any of this, you could just do this view, like I said here, where you have a building, but you thought about all of this and I think it's important. So, try to find an angle that includes it. Maybe even like right here. This might be a good angle that if you're looking here and then like, so that the perspective view, if we think about it, it depends, what view you do. But it would be like a 2-point perspective. And then we have like the bridge kind of coming in here, like a little bit. And you have like the side of the water. Maybe the bridge would come up a little bit farther so you could see like that little opening there. And then the buildings back here, that's kind of how I'm picturing it. Ooh, that's a pretty rough drawing, but something like that could best show off your building. Oh yeah. And then we get like, the top of that there. Oh boy, that's good. Anyway, if you can see where I'm thinking there. So that's just something I want you to think about because yours is, a little bit different than what everyone else has here. Try to include, what you can and still keep it really interesting, still keep the perspective, accurate. But yeah, I think this looks great. I think everything lines up and matches up. I think that all looks really good. Yeah, that's it. I don't have any other comments, so you were in a good spot. Keep going. Nathaniel, nothing from you. Ian, Jimmy, I did get, or Alex, I did get yours. Or no, sorry. Jimmy is your first name. Alex is your last name. Sorry if I responded back to you as Alex. Anyway, moving on. Your references, so unless they hadn't uploaded, you only uploaded 5 references here, and I can't even see one of them. So you are losing points for that. You're supposed to have at least 10 here. I want to see a lot more variety than what you have. So I would definitely get more references. Like I usually say at least 10 for you guys, but honestly, like when I'm searching for references, you guys saw my folder. Like, I mean, I have a lot. Like I usually have like hundreds of references. So I think you could use a little bit more variety there. And I think when we get to your buildings here, they're all kind of similar. All your references too are also only castles. I wonder if there's other things you could try to pull from that could be that adds some different, interest to this, maybe because these are all like silhouette wise, you do have variety in the shape, some are short, some are long, that type of stuff. But overall, like they're that same like blocky, like, oh, here's, 3 spikes. Here's 3 spikes. Oh, this one has 4. This one still has 3. And they're all that kind of square form. So it's something I would think about. I think in the end, your 3 orthographics ended up very different, which I am happy about. But I would just think in the future of how to try to push it more. Thinking of that overall like shape. But otherwise, I think these came out great. I didn't take any points off for either of these. I just want to tell you my thoughts about it. And then your orthographic looks really good. The only thing is you have some inconsistencies from your orthographic to your isometric. So basically the big problem is the top of these here. So on these, you got to make sure everything lines up perfectly. And first of all, these here, if you look at the width of these towers, you know, they're almost a full block wide. They start at like this line and they go to over 2/3, maybe 3/4 of that box. And so you didn't line up with that here. This cylinder you have here, it should have started here and ended here. So it should have been bigger to match up with what you have here. Because remember, that's important that your orthographic and your isometric match up because they are different views of the same thing. And maybe you wanted to change your design as you went ahead here, but then really you should go back and fix your orthographic so that it matches this. So these should have all been bigger, all three of these towers. And then the top of them here, granted, I think what you have here, I think this is more realistic in size. I think these were probably extra big, but you know, you can see it here, like how big these were supposed to be. I mean, this was supposed to be over a block. They should have been like giant on here. So maybe you changed it, but you know, it's inconsistent. This is honestly like the size it should be to match up with that. So those are the things I want to tell you that you lost a couple points for here because it doesn't match up. So it's up to you whether or not you go back and edit your orthographic or edit your isometric. It's just important that they match up. Other than that, I think everything looks good. I like your design here. I like that you included this outside wall and the interior. Some things I just want you to keep in mind is that these are all towers. They are cylinders. So that means you are going to be dealing with ellipses. So the bottom is an ellipse. All of these lines here, you will need to figure out the ellipses for. So it depends what angle you do of your building, but I'm sure we will see these in some way, most likely. So make sure that when you figure these out, that you figure out the multiple ellipses, just like that ellipse assignment way back many weeks ago. I think if you figure out, you know, you have these multiple lines here, so you have to figure out 1, 2, 3 ellipses. And this one, you'd only need to figure out the top if we're down and like looking up at the building. Is if we're looking up, you probably will see like, let's see. I'm gonna quickly draw what this would kind of look like. So if we were looking up, so if you imagine this is like the underside of this tower, you would see the ellipse that you know connects to it. So that's another ellipse. If we're looking up at those, you may need to figure out. So remember, it's really important that the closer they are to the horizon line, the narrower those ellipses will be, and then the farther are, the wider they will be. So those are things to keep in mind as you're going forward here. But essentially, you're just doing a cylinder. So remember to just draw the square or the rectangle that these fit in first. Start with that rectangle, figure out the ellipse on the bottom, figure out the ellipse on the top, and connect them. You have that cylinder. And then you'll just have to figure out the ellipses in the middle for those lines there. But that's all it is. Remember, break this down into simple forms, and I think that's what yours mostly is, the simple forms here. So keep that in mind. Just want to warn you, you will be dealing with ellipses. So make sure you figure them out. No cutting corners. You have to figure out all your ellipses. Other than that, I think you are in a good spot here. So that's it. Make sure you hand in more references because that's where you're losing most of your points here. And then a few points for your isometric, just not matching up with your orthographic. Otherwise, you're in a good spot. Okay, moving on. Jonathan, nothing from you. Down here, Joseph, nothing. Cameron, Nick, Gio, Juliana. Okay, great. We got your references. All looked good. Let's zoom in here. Silhouettes all look really nice. I think there's nice variety. Your orthographics look good too. I think you got a good variety between them all here. Just remember that this orthographic view is straight on, so there is no perspective. So that means we would not see this ellipse. You know, we wouldn't see this curve down unless it was like tilted. If like the roof was like an overhang that kind of like tilted forward and downward, you wouldn't see that. It would just be a line that is straight across, and then you'd see the top like that. So, you know, you in these straight on views, you can't really tell that ellipses are ellipses. They just look straight on. So just keep that in mind for the orthographic. But then your perspective is where I had some more trouble here. Or sorry, your isometric. Ooh, even I keep getting the words mixed up. Okay, so there's a few problems here. First of all, your planks of wood here, these are all at like a strange angle. Remember in isometric that everything is parallel. There is no converging lines or anything like that. So assuming, it depends what your intention is for the design of your building. But assuming this building was everything lines up, everything is perpendicular and parallel like a real building, I'm going to make a straight line here that's essentially my ruler. There we go. So every line that goes across this will be parallel to this. So just like all of these lines match up, you see that's why we have this grid to remind you. Even the bottom, all of the lines are all perfectly parallel when we look at the bottom of the grid. But now when we look at your building, let's see that line doesn't match up with this. Even this line's a little bit off. This line's a little bit off, but then we get to the planks of wood. You can see how that does not match up. It's not parallel. And that's the whole thing about the isometric view, which is what makes it so easy, is that all these lines should be perfectly parallel. And I can see it, like when I look at your what you drew here above the grid, I can see it doesn't match up. And this is why, like when I did mine, I drew like these little rulers, and then I would just, you know, copy and paste it all over so that every single line was parallel. So that's like a big kind of critical error here that's wrong with your isometric. Unless, and that's where intention comes into this, unless you did not want your building to all be, you know, perpendicular and parallel. Let's say you wanted your building to look weathered, like it was built on a dock that was uneven and falling apart. Then you can get away with things like this. But when I look at your drawing here, your orthographic, everything looks straight and perpendicular, everything is centered. But then we get to this and it's not. So it's hard for me to tell your intent on this. It's totally possible you could have it all crooked, and you can see the building here doesn't even line up. The edge of the building does not line up with the planks of wood. And in reality, when they would build a building, they would line up. So that's where you lost, you know, a lot of your points here this week is for that. But there's a few other problems on here. Let's keep going. So that also, come on, let's make a new. So also, this does not match up with your orthographic. When we look at this, this plank here, this walkway that you have here, it looks centered, right? It's about this wide. It takes up about a third of this whole thing. You know, all of these are pretty much evenly sized. But when we look at this, if you look how wide this is, and then how narrow this is, and how wide this is, that it's not centered. Now, maybe we're thinking about a perspective view, because you remember in perspective, things don't appear centered. You know, things that are farther away appear narrower than things that are closer. But remember, this is not a perspective view. This is isometric. In isometric, everything should line up. So these pillars here, let's say you put them, I mean, they're nearly in the right spot. They're actually a little bit closer. They're not quite in the center of this square. They're a little bit inside. So if you figure here's the center, these should have been like here and here. That's where this should have been. So it's a little bit off, but not terrible. You also have them a little bit too tall, I think, too. These are also seemed pretty short. Like they seem shorter than the door. You know, they're half the height of the door, but your door is this high here, and it looks the same height as these. So these should be much smaller than what you have. Remember, got to keep everything in relativity. So, and then these lines going back would be parallel to this. So this should be parallel. This line going back should be parallel. And then that would make this look more even. I got a few little lines here. I'm going to get rid of that. If you did that, now this seems a little bit better. So now this side and this side should be even. So that helps line things up a little bit more. Remember to gotta keep looking at your orthographic and make sure it lines up with your isometric. Also, the tops of these should be ellipses, not circles. Remember, a circle only looks like a circle if it's turned straight on to you. And if it's at an angle in any way, it's going to be an ellipse, just like we did when we made the toy blocks. So remember, an ellipse would have fit in here, however it would fit in that box. That's what this should look like, where it's, it's narrower this way than it is that way. Whereas what you just drew were circles. They're perfect circles. So none of these are right. They should all be little ellipses. And you could essentially take this ellipse and let's see, and then copy and paste it. The best way to do it to make sure, copy, paste. There we go. If you draw that ellipse and then you just keep it portioned, keep it the same proportions and just make it smaller, that would give you, what that ellipse should look like in here. So that would have been the best way to do that, and just make sure, the line's a little bit thicker. But that's how you could have figured it out here. Can't really see it very well, but maybe we can move it. Let's see. I'll move it. Come on. It's getting small. Put it like right here. Yeah, so it should have looked something more like that. And then, so moving on here, remember there's other things like the windows here. The windows you have don't match up with the windows on here. Just looking at like the proportions of where the window is, how much space is between the window and the door, and then how much space between the window and the wall. And we look at it here, there's like the same amount of space between here, and that just doesn't match up with what you did. And the height of your door does not match up with the height of this one. This is about half the height from here to here, where this door is more like 2/3 of the height from the ground to there. So your door should be bigger. Windows should be more inside. You got to make sure it stays consistent, because if you were to hand these two drawings to someone, they would not know what to do. They wouldn't know what was right. Plus, moving on here, your building does not match, especially your roof does not match with what you have here. So what you have here, your front of the roof is wider than the top. So that means the top is narrower. But what you have here, it looks like the width from here to here is almost exactly the same as the width from here to here. And also, I think it doesn't extend far enough. You actually have the edge of this going all the way to almost the end here. And if we were to like draw a line down from where this is, it's not that far out. So this should have been much farther. Let's put it like over here. Let's put it out here. If anything, it's hanging over these little podiums. So actually, it should come out to hanging over here. These are definitely too tall. Once again, they should be shorter. This should be shorter. But this here, so let's have it so it's hanging over. We'll make a line that's parallel to the others, and there. So that's how far this extends. And then the other side should extend farther too. And then to figure out where the top is, so you got to remember that this here is probably over the center of your building. So the first thing you should do to figure out where this should go is to create an X on the side of your building here. We're going to find the center. So there's the center. That tells me the center of your building is actually too far forward. It should be farther back. And then if we want it narrower, so I'm going to keep it ending right here. I'm probably going to have to go with another color at some point here because it's getting hard to see. Here we go. So I'm going to keep this corner right here. That's where that corner is. And then this corner is right here. So we got that corner, and that corner. And then you can just connect the dots. So that's what this roof, should look like. So this looks like it's kind of like a tilted triangle. And then this should extend here. And then we're just going to connect this to here. And this will, let's say that goes a little bit farther up here. So that's how you would draw this roof. So remember, keep referencing back to your orthographic to make sure things line up. Keep checking those proportions. Where does this line up with this, with this pole here? Where does this window line up with the edge? That's what you're constantly checking here. So you got a lot of kind of issues in here, and that's where you've lost, most of your points this week. It just doesn't match up with that grid, and it doesn't match up with your orthographic. Also, these should be much, I think I mentioned it here. Yeah, these should be your little pillars here. They should be much smaller. When you do get to your final, remember, these are all cylinders. So you have to figure out the ellipse on these when you get into perspective. Luckily, you don't have a lot going on here, but you do need to figure out the ellipse. This is a cylinder, right? You need to figure out the ellipse on the top and the ellipse on the bottom, and then you can just connect the sides. That's what you're going to have to do. And remember, actually, before you even make the ellipse on top and the bottom, remember you have to start with that cube that it fits in, the box. So to make these in perspective, remember you will make a box, a tall rectangular box that fits, in that this shape will fit into. And then once you make this box, actually let's make this 3-dimensional so we can see, the front and the back. It's rough. But once you make that like clear box, you make the cylinder for the top and the cylinder for the bottom and connect the sides. So remember, it's very important. You have ellipses in here. You're going to have to figure out the ellipses. Got to use subdivision. There is no faking it when we get to perspective. So I'm just warning you now. Make sure you draw your ellipses. Make sure you figure them all out correctly. And make sure if these aren't lining up, either you fix your orthographic to match your isometric, or you fix your isometric to match your orthographic. But either way, they should both be matching up. Okay, I think I covered it all here. And remember, you can make this grid on the bottom here when we get into perspective, when we get to layout things. Remember, when you have your perspective drawing, it depends what view you end up doing. But remember, you can start with that grid like a checkerboard in perspective. You draw that in perspective. Remember, find your horizon lines, find your vanishing points, 2-point perspective here, and make that grid just like we did for the toy thing. And then you can put your building on top of it if you make sure it matches up with what you did with your isometric. So that's the stuff I want you to think about as you're going forward here. Yeah, so that's it. I do like your design. I think it's interesting. Just make sure you're consistent, because consistency is everything when it comes to perspective. Okay, moving on. Meg, yours looks great. Your references all looked good. Your silhouettes are a little lacking here. Some of them are not all silhouettes. Some of these are all very similar. Like these 3 are almost practically the same thing. Even this one's practically the same. There's tiny differences, but I would have liked a little bit more variety in those. So we lost, there's a note here. Oh, I did not fully encolor it. Yeah, but that's not the point of the silhouettes. The point of the silhouettes is you shouldn't necessarily be thinking about those details yet. It should just be that simple form. And then in the next step, you can play with those details. Because you could have a silhouette, and then you could have one silhouette and make 3 completely different buildings. So that's why they should have been filled in. But I'm more concerned about the fact that a lot of these are a little too similar. That's what concerns me more, but that's where you lost some points this week. Okay, moving on. Your orthographics all look good though. They all look very different. I think you did a good job of changing them around, so they all look unique. I'm happy with that. And then your isometric looks good. The only problem is your orthographic. Let's move this here. Your orthographic and your isometric don't match up totally. So when I look at your orthographic, this here, like there's a little bit of space between the here and the edge of the grid, and there's space between here and the edge of the grid. But for both of these, you have them almost up to the edge. And then height-wise, this, you have it less than 3 blocks high, but this one's like 3.5 blocks high. Actually, no, I think that might even line up with the top. So it just doesn't match what you have here. And it probably is a case of, you decided to enlarge this, and this would have been easier to do in Photoshop. But if you did enlarge this, I would do this and enlarge. If you did enlarge that for losing my train of thought here. For your isometric, then for your orthographic should have matched up. So even if I enlarge this so it almost fits in the whole thing, it still doesn't match height-wise. Like this still doesn't go all the way to the top. So there's inconsistencies here from your orthographic to your isometric. So that's where you lost, just a couple points here, is making sure that all matches up, because that's super, super important that these things match up. Okay, but other than that, I think your isometric looks great. Oop, nope. Bridge. Your isometric looks great. Everything, I think, lines up with this, other than the size of it. The proportions of it does not match, how it fits in the grid here. They should be a 1-to-1 ratio. But other than that, everything looks great. The roof all looks great. All the little window boxes are really nice. So I love all of that here. You do have, oops, I'm gonna open up the JPEG. You do have steps. So remember when you do your final drawing that you do figure out the perspective of the steps. I do have that video from earlier in this semester. From a couple weeks ago. So make sure you figure out your steps. I think that's the only thing that's kind of challenging here. Everything else seems pretty straight on. Yeah. Other than that, I think you're great. You just lost a couple points here for, as I said, for making sure it doesn't match up and your silhouettes not being super, having a super amount of variety. But other than that, you're in a good spot here. Okay. Great, moving on. Christian, nothing. Evelyn, yours looks good here. So you have your silhouettes. You did include these white details for, what doors and stuff. But really the silhouette should have been that. Just a silhouette. There shouldn't have been any details. You're actually spending more time on them by including these details here. That's the stuff you figure out in the next step. So it's not exactly what I'm looking for the silhouette sketches. Other than that, you got some variety here. Some of these are a little boring, a little similar. It's not, not a super crazy building you have here. Like in general, I don't think you had a whole, there isn't a giant range of things you could have done for this type of building. So I'm not too concerned about that. Just make sure that you have some variety and you don't, worry about these details yet for that stage. But other than that, your orthographics all look good. I think, they're a little similar, but I think you change them up enough. They have different silhouettes. There's still that triangle top on here that's similar, but as I said, you change it up enough that it's different. Okay. And then we get to this here. So you did do your orthographic views for this, although for the front, top, and side view, which I'm so happy you did. It's going to make life much easier for you. But A couple things is, first of all, your grids aren't perfect squares. These are rectangles. And it's really important that they're squares so that it matches up with this one. You know, these are much taller than they are wide. And these actually don't even look like squares either. These actually look too long, a little too long. So it doesn't quite match up maybe. But that's just something to think about. Otherwise, I think these all line up? Yeah. So this is like 2 blocks wide. Yeah. Other than that, I think they match up. Maybe it's a little short. Like if I look how close this is to this edge and how close this is to this edge, you actually have a lot more space. You have a little bit more space here. So this actually should have been a little bit longer. That's the only thing, it's a little off. And remember, consistency is everything. But more importantly, your isometric here has issues. So remember, isometric, it's that fake perspective. All of the lines should be parallel. Just like the lines of the grid here. I'm going to make my little ruler here. No, I do it on a new layer. I'm going to make my ruler. Remember, just like I did in my video, I made like a little ruler here. And then I would pick this up. And every single line should be parallel to this. And we get to yours, and like all your grid's all parallel, but we get to yours, and I don't know what happened to this roof, but all of these lines on the roof should be parallel. You know, they literally, you could take this line, copy and paste it, just like I did in my video. Here we go. And then paste it there, and then we could copy these again and paste them here, but they are all perfectly parallel, and yours are not. Yours are all over the place, which just makes this look it looks messed up. It doesn't look right. And the same thing happens, you know, with the lines all going this way. I'm going to call this the width. The lines going along the width, you know, should all be parallel. But then the lines going along the depth should also be parallel. So let's say if this is the depth, all lines going along this way should be parallel. Like the bottom of your building here, but these lines should be parallel. This line, you know, along the bottom here should be parallel. And you can see they're all off. The roof of your building's off. You got to go back to those toy blocks. It's just a slightly more complicated toy block. And you could have drawn this as toy blocks. You could have done the bottom, you know, the bottom's a rectangle, right? The top piece here, this is essentially, it's a half a circle. It's like a half a cylinder. You actually could have drawn the whole cylinder and then just, you know, cut it off. And then the top here, this is like a box that's sitting on top of the cylinder here. So you really just think about these little shapes, and then this is just a pyramid or a ramp, 2 ramps, I guess, that are on top of that. You think about all those simple shapes that are on here. But so you lost a lot of points this week because things aren't lining up, and it's really important that they line up. You know, this ceiling should have been like this. The roof of this, it should have been, you know, parallel to this line. And actually even my line's a little bit off. Yeah, something like that. That's where this should have been. And the bottom of this too would have been parallel. And then you would have made the point, you know, connected those lines for the point. So you can see how that's off. You know, these lines are all off. Everything is just at the wrong angle here. And then you also have to remember that this here, so this is it's an ellipse that just gets cut off. It's like a half an ellipse. And you gotta remember, think back to when we did your names in perspective, that the front of this, if this is an ellipse, the back of this would just be an ellipse like it too. And then since there's no perspective in isometric, they would have looked exactly the same. So you'd have to figure out that entire ellipse that matches here to here. So this angle on the back is also wrong as well. Make sure as also that things are centered. Like make sure your door here does not look centered inside this box. Remember, you can make an X to find where the center is. and that will tell you where the center, so your door should be centered. Same thing for, let's get another layer. Same thing for the top of this building here. Remember, if you create an X here, that could tell you where the top is. And actually, it looks like you did that there. This actually looks centered, so that's great. Make sure you do that, though, when you get to perspective. Make sure that you make your doors centered here. It should even be centered. It should be centered here. Yeah, you're still a little bit off. Even these lines, your vertical lines, are a little bit off. They're not perfectly vertical. So there's a lot off here. You did do the extra credit, which is great. You're going to get some extra points for this. But make sure you stay consistent. And actually the width here, you weren't even consistent either, because this is 2 blocks wide. But then we go here, this one matches up, but this one is too wide. This actually should have been narrower. This should have lined up perfectly with, with this line. So it's actually too wide compared to that. And actually, you have this come to a point here in this side view, and you didn't have it come to a point here. We actually could have figured out, remember, that point should be centered. So let's find, even though this is off, but you should find your center, and that would tell you where your point is. So it's not quite an ellipse. It's, an ellipse with a point on it, but you should figure that out too. Figure out that center. Make sure that lines up. We know here that the center, because this is already divided up, you do know that this is the center. So actually, even my line was a little bit off there. Your center should have been here. That's where the point of this should have been. So, sum it all up. Consistency is everything. Make sure all of these match up. Your orthographic and isometric should match up perfectly. And the same thing when you get to your perspective. You want to make sure it matches up with the design you created. So that's where you lost a lot of your points this week, is for those things. I do like the design of your building, and I like that it's kind of got like, 2 interesting sides. You got the one side here and the one side here. I think that's really nice. I think the building's great. I just want to make sure your execution of that building holds up to your design, because your design's really nice. Okay, moving ahead here. Derek. So you got this. Let's see. Sorry. Whew. Feel like I've been talking a while now. Derek, yours looks good here. Your references all looked good. Your silhouettes are good, although a couple of these look like animals. Are they supposed to look like animals? I mean, that looks like a dinosaur. This looks like a whale. That kind of looks like a duck. Am I imagining it? Were you purposely trying to make them like animals? I don't know. But you have some variety in here, which I like. I think that looks good. That was just my thought. But otherwise, your orthographics all look really good. I can see that kind of duck shape in here. I'm glad you used it, but it doesn't look like the duck. I think these all look good. The only problem is your orthographic and your isometric don't match up. So it's the same thing I've been talking about with other people here. I mean, you have this fitting in the grid here. Like this wheel is within that grid. There's like a half a block between the end of the grid and here. But on this one, you have it outside of the grid. This is also outside of the grid on this side here. It looks like this may go outside a little bit, but it's not quite consistent. Let's actually open this up. Here we go. Yeah, you want to make sure it's consistent. And if you decide to change things when you got to your isometric view, that's fine, but then you got to go back and fix your orthographic drawing so that matches up with it. Also, looking, at the height of this, you have this building about a little under 3 blocks high, but now when we get to here, you have it going all the way up to the top. So that's not consistent with what you have here. As I said, the width is not consistent. This is much wider. If you did decide to enlarge the whole thing so it fits the grid, which I think is good, but then you should have done that with this view too, because you want to make sure it matches up. Also, it looks like, so from here, you made this 2 blocks wide, and here, it's a little under 2 blocks wide. It's not quite 2 blocks wide. So you made this a little bit wider in proportion, And then I feel like, well, that's about 2 blocks. Yeah, this still should have been going a little bit farther to match up with that. This should have been going outside the box. So that would have made this all a little bit longer. That would have gone even farther. So it's just not consistent. And then you should have figured out, this is an ellipse in isometric so easy because you remember all you need to do is fit it within that box here. So you could have just drawn the ellipse that fits here, using an ellipse tool, and then enlarge it so that it fits here. So you want to make sure that's accurate. It feels a little bit off. Make sure when you do your final view, these are ellipses. This is really a cylinder. This is just a thin cylinder. Make sure you figure out your cylinders in perspective, your ellipses in perspective. It's super important that that's accurate. So that's going to be a big thing. There's a possibility we may not see it what view we do, but I feel like this is kind of an important feature. So keep that in mind, that you will need to figure out those ellipses. But otherwise, I think everything else should be okay. Just watch that proportions. Oh yeah, you also had a window here. And what happened to your window? You lost your window there. All about consistency, making sure everything lines up. So that's where you lost points this week. But otherwise, I think your design looks nice. I think it looks really cozy. Oh, I am a little confused, that reminds me, about this thing here. You do have it look like this roof's at an angle, but then you add this bump. So I'm just curious structurally how that works. Like, what is this bump? I just want to make sure you're thinking about that. It's hard, obviously I can't really tell from this like front angle or from this angle here. This also doesn't really match up with how big the bump is on here. It looks bigger from this view. So things I want you to think about as you're going forward, what is that bump? How is that working structurally into your building? Just things to think about. Okay. Whew. Yeah, other than that, I think it's a nice design. Just make sure you stay consistent with everything. Okay. I think that is it, you guys. Great work. Once again, I am nitpicking, but remember, it's perspective. Everything needs to be accurate. I think you guys are in a great spot here. I love your building designs, and I'm really looking forward to see where you guys all go with this. So great job, and good luck with the rest of the assignment.